My name is Ethan, and this happened during my second year of college. After my freshman year, I didn't secure a dorm spot, so I had to scramble for off-campus housing. Eventually, I found a spot in a co-op, a small cluster of 3 houses somewhat close to campus, though not as near as I'd have liked. It wasn't perfect, but it was affordable, and since I had a bike, the longer commute didn't bother me too much. Most of the people living there were students around my age, though there were a few outliers, some graduate students, a couple of teaching assistants, and a handful of older folks working on degrees later in life. But one person caught my attention right away, an older woman who lived in one of the neighboring houses. She looked to be in her late 50s, maybe older, with thinning gray hair and a noticeable limp, like she'd hurt her back at some point. She kept to herself, rarely spoke, and always wore this vacant, unreadable expression. The first time I noticed something odd about her was in our shared kitchen. It was already strange that she was there. Each house had its own kitchen, so I couldn't figure out why she'd wander into ours. She wasn't cooking or eating, or even chatting with anyone. She just stood there, silent, while the rest of us buzzed around, making food, laughing, and playing music. She didn't join in, she just watched. A couple of times our eyes met, and I got this uneasy feeling that she was staring at me in particular, though I told myself that was ridiculous. No one else seemed to notice her, which struck me as odd. Maybe they knew something I didn't. A few days later, I saw her again. I was working on an assignment in my room when I glanced out the window, and there she was standing in the middle of the street, looking up. It was late, chilly enough that she should have been bundled up, but she wasn't. I couldn't tell if she was staring at my window specifically, or just the house in general, but it felt personal. On impulse, I gave her a small wave, trying to be polite. I regretted it instantly. She didn't wave back. Instead, she hopped up and down a few times like she was thrilled, then darted off toward one of the other houses, hers, I assumed. My stomach twisted. Not only had I acknowledged her, but now she knew exactly where my room was. That night, I asked one of my housemates about her. He shrugged and said she'd always been around, and that I should just ignore her like everyone else did. When I pressed him, he admitted he didn't know much, just passing on advice he'd gotten when he moved in. It didn't sit right with me, so I kept asking around until I got a vague answer from a senior in her house. He said she had some tie to the university, was a bit eccentric, but wasn't known for being dangerous. When I asked why no one found her behavior strange, he said it wasn't their call. The property manager decided who lived there. It wasn't a great explanation, but I didn't have much choice but to let it go and try to forget about her. Then things escalated. One night, I stepped out of my room and almost collided with her. She was standing right outside my door, in the hallway, past midnight on a quiet weekday when the house was practically empty. I jolted back, startled. She didn't say a word, didn't even flinch, just turned and shuffled off like I'd interrupted her. That wasn't the only time either. Over the next few weeks, I kept catching her in places she shouldn't have been, lingering in odd corners or hovering near my room. Then I lost my room key. The co-op used to be a single hotel, so each room had its own lock and key. Most people left their doors unlocked, but I wasn't comfortable with that, so losing my key was a hassle. I had a spare, but I'd still need to get a replacement made, which annoyed me more than I could afford to deal with. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night for no clear reason. Then I heard it, a faint thumping from my closet, every 20 seconds or so, like something was shifting around in there. I'm not the type to freeze up in a crisis, so I decided to handle it myself. I slipped out of bed, took a steadying breath, and crept toward the closet, my pulse pounding. In one quick move, I yanked the door open and let out a wild yell. She was there, crouched inside, one of my scarves looped around her neck, her eyes wide and unblinking. In her hand was a kitchen knife. My shout must have spooked her because she lunged at me, the blade aimed right for me. I screamed again, this time for real, out of sheer terror, and managed to wrestle her to the floor. She was small and fragile, so I disarmed her without much trouble, but that didn't make it any less horrifying. She thrashed and snapped at me, shrieking as I held her down. I shouted for help, and soon footsteps thundered down the hall. My friend Jake rushed in, helping me keep her pinned while someone else called the police. The rest of the night blurred together. The cops arrived fast, cuffed her, and took her away. She'd gone silent by then, refusing to speak, which only made it creepier. They found my missing key in her pocket, no surprise there. A couple of weeks later, we learned the truth. She was the property manager's sister. He'd been letting her stay there off the books, despite her serious mental health problems. Instead of getting her help, he'd stashed her in an empty room. I heard he got arrested later for negligence and a bunch of other charges, which he deserved. Honestly, I blame him more than her. I even feel a little sorry for her, but that doesn't change the fact that she came at me with a knife. I could have died that night. I still don't know why she fixated on me, and I hope I never find out. I'm graduating soon, and while I'll miss parts of college, that night will always haunt my memories here. This isn't really my story, but I witnessed it all unfold, so I'm sharing it anyway. My name is Clara, and I've lived in a cozy 2-story house with my husband Daniel for nearly 2 decades. Our kids are grown and off living their own lives, which I'm thrilled about. What I'm going to tell you happened last year. Someone had just moved into the house across the street, which was a relief. I was tired of staring at an empty place all the time. I'm retired, so I spend a lot of time on my front porch, knitting, reading, or just soaking in the day with Daniel. I enjoy listening to mystery audiobooks or soft music while I'm out there. The new neighbor was a young man, probably in his mid-20s. He drove a sleek, shiny sedan and always wore sharp, stylish clothes, so I figured he either had money or was putting on a good show. I don't mean to sound judgmental. He was actually a kind person. A few days after moving in, he came over to introduce himself. His name was Miles, and he'd been out of college for a couple of years, just as I'd guessed. He was sharp and friendly, hitting it off with Daniel right away. They bonded over football and old college tales, some I hadn't heard from Daniel in years. Miles said he worked freelance in media, doing projects for some online figure. I didn't quite follow, but it seemed to pay well, judging by his car and the way he talked about investments with Daniel. He came across as a decent guy. For a few months, everything was fine. Since I'm often on the porch, Miles would wave when he left his house, and I'd wave back. Then I started noticing a young woman showing up at his place every so often. She drove a little red coupe, had dark hair, and looked about his age, the kind of person you'd expect someone like him to date. She dressed a bit boldly, which I didn't love, but I figured she was his girlfriend, maybe stopping by when he wasn't home. She had a key, so it made sense. It became routine. Once or twice a week, I'd see her car pull up while Miles was out. She'd go inside, stay for a bit, then leave. I didn't get why she was there, but I chalked it up to modern dating habits and kept it to myself. One evening, I saw them together. Miles pulled into his driveway with her in the passenger seat, confirming my hunch that they were a couple. But not long after, things seemed to shift. One afternoon, while I was watering my flower beds, I heard yelling from across the street. Miles and the girl were in his driveway, arguing loudly. I couldn't make out the words, but she was furious, flailing her arms, practically shouting in his face. It looked like she might hit him. Eventually, she stormed to her car, slammed the door, and sped off. Miles just sighed and went inside, oblivious to me watching. I figured it was a typical relationship spat. Every couple argues, and it wasn't my business to meddle. But then I kept seeing her car at his house when he wasn't there, not just once or twice, but several times. I mentioned it to Daniel, and he told me to mind my own business, saying it was rude to snoop. I agreed, but I couldn't shake my curiosity. Then came the night everything unraveled. Daniel and I were jolted awake by sirens blaring outside. We hurried out to the porch, joining a few neighbors who'd gathered. Miles's house was surrounded, police cars, an ambulance, the works. We watched as officers led the girl out in handcuffs. She didn't fight or yell, just stared straight ahead, emotionless. Then they brought Miles out on a stretcher, covered in blood. I stifled a gasp. We didn't see him again for a week, and I was beside myself with worry. When he finally returned, Daniel and I went over to check on him. He welcomed us in and spilled the whole story. Her name was Sophie, and she'd confessed everything to the police, making their job easy. She wasn't supposed to have a key. She'd swiped his spare and copied it without him knowing. She'd started demanding things, lavish dinners, gifts, weekend getaways. When he pushed back, she turned controlling and volatile, and their relationship soured. He hadn't even realized she was showing up uninvited. She'd been tracking his phone somehow, which I didn't know was possible. She'd rifled through his belongings, but worse, she'd hidden tiny cameras in his bedroom. Every time she came by when he was out, she was swapping batteries and checking them. The fight I'd overheard was Miles trying to end things. She wouldn't accept it, so they settled on a break. But she'd seen everything through those cameras. The next night, she showed up with a knife. I won't go into the gory details, you can imagine. Miles managed to overpower her. but not before she'd hurt him badly. The doctors said he'd narrowly escaped needing major surgery, or worse. Daniel and I tried to comfort him, but he was rattled. Before we left, he said he'd learned not to flash his wealth, especially around certain types. He moved out soon after, saying the house didn't feel safe anymore, especially knowing Sophie had friends who might have known where he lived. We never saw him again. I hope he's doing all right. No one, especially someone that young, should have to endure something so awful. When I moved into my new place, I just wanted a clean slate. I won't bore you with the specifics, but a messy breakup with an ex made staying in my old town unbearable. I'd come into some money young and made dumb choices about the people I let into my life. Lesson learned. The neighborhood I picked was perfect, quiet, low crime, full of families. The houses are spread out, which I loved, but oddly, the property right next to mine sits much closer than the others. And that house, it's massive. When I first saw it, I pictured a sprawling family living there, grandparents, kids, the whole deal. I couldn't have been more off base. I didn't want to be a jerk neighbor, even though I was trying to keep a low profile. So, I made the rounds to introduce myself to everyone. For some reason, I saved the folks next door for last. Don't ask me why. Most people I met were friendly, real salt-of-the-earth types, mostly parents with young kids. They were a little intimidating, honestly, with their picture-perfect lives and obvious success. I wasn't sure how a single guy in his late 20s like me would fit in, but that was my problem to wrestle with. By the time I got to the house next door, I was wiped out from all the small talk. I almost bailed, but I knew I'd never muster the energy again if I didn't do it then. So, I sucked it up and trudged up their driveway. I'd gotten used to middle-aged couples answering doors, so when a guy who looked younger than me, sporting a shaggy haircut, opened up, I was thrown. I recovered fast and launched into my new neighbor routine. Halfway through, he cut me off with a big grin, saying something like, "Finally, someone from my generation. What a shock." I laughed and admitted I felt the same, joking about how out of place I felt among all the family types. He said not to sweat it. Most people here kept to themselves, which eased my mind. He introduced himself as Lucas and suggested I swing by for a drink sometime. I shrugged and said, "Why not now?" expecting him to chuckle and wave me in. Instead, he glanced back into his house, like he was checking something, then turned back and said he'd love to, but he was tied up with work. Curious, I asked what he did. His smile faded a bit, and after an awkward pause, he just said, "Finance," with no details. It felt off, but I let it slide, saying, "Fair enough." I asked if he had roommates, and he said no, he lived there solo. That blew my mind, considering the size of the place. We chatted a bit more, he gave me his number, and then he ducked back inside. I was stoked to have someone my age nearby, especially since he seemed laid back, but it nagged at me how weird it was for a guy like that to rattle around in that huge house alone. Sure, I was solo too, but my place was way smaller. That was 6 months ago. For a few weeks after, nothing much happened. I texted Lucas a couple of times to hang out, but he always brushed me off with excuses about being swamped with work. Eventually I stopped trying, not out of spite, just a you do you vibe. I'm not one to chase someone who's not interested. Thing is, I never saw anyone at his place. No guests, no deliveries, nothing. His car was always parked there, but I never caught him leaving. No takeout, no grocery runs. I started wondering what he even ate. The guy was a phantom. I work from home, and my office is on the second floor, with a clear view of his property. I know it sounds nosy, but his house was right there, impossible to ignore when I glanced up from my screen. Then one night, a Tuesday, I remember it clearly. I woke up at 2 a.m. to loud music. I sleep with my windows cracked, so it hit me fast. At first, I thought it was a dream, but no, it was real. I stumbled to the window and saw 6 or 7 cars crammed into Lucas's driveway. He was throwing a party. I'm not some grouch who hates noise. I've hosted my share of bashes, but it was a weeknight, and the volume was ridiculous. I figured I'd pop over, knock, and ask him to turn it down. I threw on a jacket and headed across. From outside, it looked like a rager. I banged on the door, no answer. I pulled out my phone to text Lucas, but stopped, figuring he'd just dodge me again with some lame excuse. I went back the next morning and knocked harder. Still nothing. On a whim, I tried the handle, expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The door swung right open. Inside, I saw a pile of shoes in the entryway, at least 8 pairs, but something felt wrong. The place was dead silent. No people, no mess. I stepped further in, thinking I'd find someone in the living room or kitchen, but it was empty. No cups, no snacks, nothing. I could still hear voices over faint music, though, which confused me. Then it clicked. It wasn't music, it was a recording. Laughter, chatter, glasses clinking, all fake. A staged party. But that didn't explain the shoes or the cars. Someone had been here. I should have left then, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept through the house until I spotted a door cracked open, leading to the basement. Something told me the answers were down there. I nudged it open and started down the dark stairs, guided by a dim glow from below. At the bottom, I saw the light spilling from another door deeper in the basement. I edged closer, and over the fake party noise, I picked up something else, a low, rhythmic grinding like a machine running. I got close enough to peek through the gap. 3 men stood inside, staring at something out of my line of sight. They were older, way older than Lucas, dressed in heavy work gear, gloves, goggles, boots. The shoes upstairs didn't match what they were wearing. I couldn't see what they were focused on, but then a sharp, chemical smell hit me, like ammonia or bleach. My gut screamed that I was in danger. I turned to bolt, moving as quietly as I could. Halfway back, the light behind me dimmed. Someone had closed the door. I didn't hear it over the recording, but I felt the shift. I bolted up the stairs, raced through the house, and burst outside. Instead of running straight home, I cut through my yard, hopped the fence, and slipped in through my back door, locking it tight. Heart pounding, I went up to my office, killed the lights, and crouched by the window. Lucas's place looked still, but minutes later, the front door flew open. 7 or 8 guys spilled out, older like the ones I'd seen, scanning the street and yard. Lucas wasn't with them. A couple started arguing. One shoved another, and I thought it'd turn into a fight, but they all went back inside. The fake party noise cut off soon after. I stayed there, trying to piece it together. Calling the cops crossed my mind, but what would I say? The music was gone, and I had no proof of anything illegal. What bugged me most was how none of my neighbors had complained about the noise. Most had kids. And the shoes? If those guys were boots, why the extra pairs? Too many questions, no answers. I crawled into bed, rattled. The next morning, I checked from my window. Every car, including Lucas's, was gone. I tried working but kept glancing over at his empty house. Hours passed, no sign of him. I went for a walk, partly to clear my head, partly to peek through his windows. Nothing. Days turned into weeks, and Lucas never came back. His grass grew wild, and a stack of packages piled up by his door. I couldn't let it go, so I asked a few neighbors if they'd heard the party that night. No one had a clue, even when I pointed out the house and time. I felt like I was losing it. That was months ago. His place still sits empty, neglected. I don't know what to think. Maybe it's nothing, but why fake a party unless you're hiding something big? And why leave the door unlocked? Maybe that's what those guys were arguing about. The fact that no one else heard anything makes me wonder if I'm paranoid, or if I stumbled into something deeper. If Lucas ever shows up, I'm torn between confronting him and pretending I saw nothing.